Hey there, Jed Bratt here. As we all know, with fair certainty at this point, Joe Biden is set to become the 46th president of the United States in January. Now, we all know that the president is the face of the country, but when it comes to imposing widespread changes immediately, a president's power only goes so far. And as we're approaching the end of 2020, a year that, despite the unprecedented everything that has happened, was very kind to real estate prices, we are entering a year with a new administration and a great deal of momentum in the real estate space. Now, to start, let's discuss the specific macro factors that have really had the largest impact on housing prices so far this year. And I want to additionally clarify that this video is not specific to any one market or state. This is simply my perspective on real estate as a whole going into 2021 and the potential impacts that a new administration may have on real estate at a very high level. And of course, it's important to understand that real estate markets are local. But while these factors may influence local markets to varying extents or in different ways, these factors are key in how local real estate markets also function. As I discuss each of these factors, I'm going to label them as either red, meaning a likely detrimental influence on real estate prices, yellow as relatively neutral, or green as a positive influence or stimulus on real estate prices. And real quick, if you enjoy real estate videos such as this on a number of topics and regular market updates, then be sure to go ahead and hit the like button and subscribe right now for more content like this in the future. I appreciate you. Now, the first two factors I'm referring to are supply and demand. Now, of course, these are the most basic fundamental elements of the housing market cycle, just as they are with most things in a capitalistic system. And 2020 brought with it a massive increase in buyer demand due to a number of factors. First, interest rates hit all-time new lows over a dozen times so far this year. And the national 30-year fixed rate average as of late 2020 sits at 2.72%. This sharp decrease in rates immediately increased potential homebuyers' borrowing power by a factor of over 10%. Secondly, the widespread lockdowns due to the virus ignited a shift to work from home unlike anything we've ever seen before. In addition to the increased affordability that came with new lower rates, a new home buyer's perceived value of a home in owning their own home has also increased, as now home has become much more than just a roof over their head. Now the idea of home has expanded widely to include now necessary things such as a home office and even a home gym space. Along with the need for new office and gym space now at home, naturally comes a massive increase in the time spent at home, which also directly increases the intrinsic value of a home to the owner, which justifies further investment towards improvements, which then increases its market value in the actual value of the property as well. As proof of this, take for instance Home Depot's revenue report in the second quarter of 2020, which showed an over 23% increase from 2019. The third part of this 2020 trifecta was that due to a combination of the lockdowns, work from home, and even lower rates, which enticed homeowners to refinance and record to a record low rate and stay put, is the nearly 50% drop in housing inventory in many housing markets across the country. So essentially what we have experienced thus far this year is the ultra low supply, dirt cheap rates, and increased demand, which set real estate markets across the country up for monster appreciation, which we've witnessed nearly this entire year. And nearing the end of this year, this environment has yet to let up. This leads us to the next question. What factors could cause this strong momentum in real estate to falter? Is there something that a President Biden could or would do that could derail this, or is there likely a correction around the corner, independent of a presidential intervention? Now, there are always unlimited catalysts to how things could really play out. I don't think anyone in 2019 November accurately predicted what 2020 would look like. Yet here we are, right? But let's talk through some possibilities based on what we do know, beginning with interest rates. Now, the 10-year federal Treasury note has continued to very gradually recover. At the time I'm recording this, it still sits below 1%, but with the news of the vaccine and small but continual improvements in the economy, this is likely to continue trending higher. Of course, if COVID numbers start accelerating with momentum again, this could change. However, the sight of a vaccine at the end of the tunnel offers a great deal of comfort, I think, to investors in the bond market, and at least for the time being, this rate should continue to climb. And why am I even talking about the 10-year Treasury note? Well, historically, the 10-year note has been one of the best benchmarks to a mortgage interest rates. As bond rates fall, mortgage-backed security yields also drop, which in turn is reflected in mortgage rates. Now, one major factor considering mortgage rates this year has been that the Federal Reserve has been helping hold interest rates low by buying massive amounts of mortgage-backed securities, which also ensures mortgage lenders can continue lending, and it ensures higher amounts of liquidity. This is also known as quantitative easing. And per the last several Federal Reserve Open Market Committee meetings, Fed Chair Jerome Powell has continued to suggest that they intend to continue buying assets as they seek to meet their inflation target of around 2% over time. So they're okay with some months or some quarters being higher than 2% and some being lower, but their overall average target has been 2%. The consensus also stands that the Fed will continue to purchase mortgage-backed securities at the current rate through the end of 2021. This, to me, means we can reasonably expect to see continued low rates into 2021 and possibly beyond, although the extent of quantitative easing in 2020 and beyond, 2022 and beyond, remains to be seen. I'll also note that the current mortgage spread between the primary mortgage rate and the current coupon, as it's called, remains historically high, which basically means that lenders' profit margins right now are actually larger than they typically would be. This is due in large part, I would say, to the overwhelming demand for for refinances and purchase loans that came with the lower rates. However, if refinance demand and or purchase loan demand goes down, then there is still room for further drops in rates, while allowing lenders to maintain or exceed their historical margins. One additional trend that could reverse the trend of low interest rates is inflation significantly beyond the Fed's target. In other words, if in the first and second quarter of 2021, the data comes back and shows we are significantly on track for inflation greatly exceeding the Fed's average target rate of 2% annually, then the most common way to combat this is going to be by increasing interest rates. And while we know that the Fed does not set mortgage rates directly, there is a trickle-down effect from the Fed funds rate, which is set by the Fed, which will tend to have some additional influence on the mortgage markets. But it wouldn't be the Fed funds rate, actually, that would worry me most about having a sudden impact on real estate. See, if the Fed fund is of the opinion that inflation needs to be brought under control, their most likely knee-jerk reaction would be to stop or reduce the buying of mortgage-backed securities. This, on the other hand, would directly impact mortgage interest rates. If this happens, not only would the increase in rates directly impact affordability and therefore demand, but it could also potentially trigger a knee-jerk reaction for sellers who've been sitting on the sidelines waiting to list. If this happens, then we could rapidly see a red-hot seller's market turn neutral and, in many cases, sometimes even decline. Now, I don't expect that any increase would be drastic, at least not right away. And I'm talking about in interest rates from the Fed. In fact, I would expect it to be as minimal as necessary, as increasing interest rates in a recovering economy can rapidly reverse the trend of inflation and result in negative side effects. And that's obviously not what the Fed wants. A glance at what happened when rates began climbing in 2018 demonstrates how quickly things can turn sour, even for red-hot housing markets. Now, what could a Biden presidency do to influence this factor? Well, Jerome Powell's current term as the chair of the Fed isn't up until February 2022, and his term on the board is still until 2028. And while Biden could nominate another chair as a replacement once Powell's term is up, it would not be unheard of for him to keep him on as chair beyond his current term. So for 2021, interest rates still get an expected green rating from me, as barring excessive inflation, I expect rates will continue to be a positive stimulus to real estate through 2021. Next up, let's talk demand. Now, as we discussed earlier, homebuyer demand has skyrocketed during the lockdown, mostly driven by rock bottom interest rates, along with the new work from home trend. Now in 2020, we had something in regards to demand that we are unlikely to have in 2021, and this is a large and sudden drop in interest rates, equating to a sudden increase in affordability, translating to far more financeable buyers than previously. This understandably led to a palpable increase in buyer competition and a strong run-up of housing prices. By late August, the adjustment in affordability based on mortgage payments had already been absorbed by rapid price increases. And here's an example of what I'm talking about. In early January of this year, the average 30-year fixed-rate mortgage was around 3.72%. Due to the continual drop in rates over the past year, however, the monthly mortgage payment to service a loan based on the median home price has remained relatively constant or even decreased in some cases. Essentially, the drastic run-up in prices has barely been felt by borrowers until this point. The challenge I see is that we cannot continue to necessarily expect this continued steady drop of rates into 2021 alongside housing appreciation as we have in 2020. Rates may continue to fall a bit further. However, I don't think we can reasonably expect that rates will drop at nearly the same rate as they have in the last 12 months. In fact, many leading agencies are predicting a slight increase back into the threes as we go into the new year. Now, I know we switched to talking rates here for a minute again, but what I'm talking about here is that lacking the assistance of falling interest rates going into 2020 may actually detract from buyer demand as prices now continue to rise without an accompanied lower rate. And understand that as obvious as it seems, real estate price progressions are not always logical. In the last real estate cycle in California, for example, as prices continued to climb and affordability fell, prices continued up. Now, of course, there are additional subsets of factors that fall under demand, including jobs, which are essential to demand. Now, I'm not going to go into detail here as to how Biden's plans for jobs specifically will influence the housing markets, but his plans do include substantial investments in clean energy infrastructure. So, for example, markets currently reliant on fossil fuels will likely experience decreased demand relative to other regions. So suffice it to say that the jobs market aspect of demand will be market specific and not one of the macro factors we are focusing on in this video. However, there are other factors that a Biden administration may introduce which will directly influence the entire U.S. housing market. In fact, one of the major promises that Biden has made on the campaign trail is a first-time homebuyer tax credit of up to $15,000. This would likely be brought out in a similar manner to the $7,500 tax credit by George Bush in 2008 or the $8,000 tax credit signed by Obama in 2009. The difference, Biden claims, would be that instead of needing to wait until filing taxes for the year to claim the credit, buyers would actually be able to access the homebuyer credit at the purchase. Although it's not been revealed as to how exactly this would work yet, if the Biden administration does in fact come out with a credit that first-time home buyers can apply directly to closing costs at the time of the purchase, this would be a significant stimulus to a housing market, which is already on fire. Now, the way it's worded is up to $15,000. So the way that's going to be determined whether or not you would get qualified for that full $15,000 or not is yet to be seen. The way it worked in 2008 was something along the lines of up to 10% of the purchase price of the property at a cap of $8,000. So if they were to do something similar to that, that's kind of how I would expect it to go. Now, from what we've been experiencing in our business in San Diego has been that the large majority of home buyers today are covering most, if not all, of their own closing costs. And this wasn't always the case. In fact, for the first several years of my career, we were helping nearly all of our buyer clients get the majority of their closing costs covered by the seller or via a lender credit. So I believe what this first-time homebuyer tax credit would actually do, in fact, if it's passed, is to help the lower income and starter home category of housing more than any other. It theoretically will give buyers who have struggled to save up sufficient funds for both a down payment and closing costs to compete with everyone else. All of this to say, it does appear that demand will still remain green territory going into 2021, even if there is a slight pullback due to rising prices. Now let's talk supply. And you might think that supply and demand might be inversely related, as in the reason supply would go up is because demand drops or vice versa. And that's partly true, but not entirely. See, just like with demand, there are many factors independent of each other that can affect the level of supply. Let's start with one of the most talked about potentially negative factors in the past few months, which is the prospect of a wave of foreclosures that will supposedly flood the market once the forbearance period for millions of homeowners on deferment payment plans ends. Here is the fact of the matter. Per the Mortgage Bankers Association, and I quote, nearly 2/3 of borrowers who exited forbearance remained current on their payments, repaid their forborne payments, or moved into a payment deferral plan. He goes on to say all of these borrowers have been able to resume or continue their pre-pandemic monthly payments. And mind you, this was as of early October. Folks, what this is saying is completely contrary to the negative narrative that we keep hearing in the news. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that there will not be any negative ripple effects from mortgage delinquencies in the coming months or years. But as I've explained in previous market reports over and over, is that the prediction of a mass market crash due to mortgage delinquencies is exaggerated, I think, specifically because as the latest data shows, a large number of the homeowners who took forbearance did it out of precaution as opposed to dire necessity. See, we've wised up since the 2008 housing crisis. The government-sponsored entities that would suffer the most if there were to be a massive wave of foreclosures will do everything in their power to mitigate the potential for foreclosures. This was readily evident in what we have just been discussing, that is, the generous mortgage forbearance plans. Without the widespread forbearance options that were made possible from the CARES Act, this would be another story. For now, however, foreclosure storms in the residential sector have been foiled, at least for the foreseeable future, in my opinion. Okay, so let's talk about another common concern, an eviction wave once the eviction moratoriums run out, which is currently scheduled for the end of the year unless another extension is passed. Per the latest projections, somewhere near between 6 to 20 million households potentially face eviction once the moratorium ends in January. Now, if the eviction waves play out as anticipated, this could actually be a potential catalyst for a sudden increase of inventory. See, on one hand, this year, landlords have had their hands tied on evicting non-paying tenants. On the other hand, landlords have also had the option of mortgage forbearance, assuming, of course, that the landlord that we're talking about has debt on the property. So although the tenants aren't paying and possibly the landlord might want to sell, then what's the harm in holding off and selling the property until the forbearance runs out and or they can evict the non-paying tenant in the new year and sell the property vacant for an easier sale? In fact, many landlords, I think, have probably been looking at the current market happily as prices go up, knowing that they have been benefiting from the strong appreciation despite non-paying tenants. But once their forbearance period runs out, they have a choice. Do they go ahead and put the property back on the market, put it back up for rent, and keep playing the landlord game? Well, what I think is probably going to happen is a portion of these landlords are going to decide to sell. Now, I don't necessarily say that that number is going to be far greater than it would normally be if we had been in a normal traditional market without the pandemic. However, I do believe that some of the inventory that we've been lacking is likely to show up once these evictions have resumed. The question is whether a surge of supply due to the eviction crisis will be sufficient to cause any meaningful damage to real estate prices. I think the answer to this will be largely location specific. For instance, I wouldn't be surprised if higher density urban areas like downtowns feel the pain disproportionately to the suburbs. But I also do think that eviction crisis aside, the more vividly close we get to a widely distributed vaccine, the more sellers that have been holding off on selling through the pandemic will start warming up to the idea of now listing. So what could a Biden administration do to affect supply? Well, let's start by acknowledging the short housing supply that is experienced in many of the housing markets across the United States right now is one of the primary factors that have been driving housing prices higher and higher, which can be perceived as a good thing for real estate. The problem with this unusually strong appreciation associated with massive scarcity, however, is that it's simply not sustainable, at least not without equal and opposite derogatory outcomes on those missing out. So, one of the many problems that Biden has promised to address is to increase the building and supply of affordable housing. While his plans seem to include development of an affordable housing fund, it is yet to be seen where the funding for his plans would be sourced from. One of the primary challenges, of course, with development of additional housing, period, is of course the reasons we're experiencing this shortage to start with: zoning laws and the cost of building. For example, you have states like California where housing affordability is not a problem that can be solved single-handedly. For one, the time factor in developing housing imposes a significant risk to developers. See, in states like California, developing houses is often a multi-year process just to get the project approval. And a lot can happen during that time, from a shifting economy to changes in legislature that could severely impact the business plan of the development. Take, for example, AB 1482, rent control, which was passed just in 2019. Add to the uncertainty of time the not in my backyard battles against developments, the restrictive zoning laws, and rising construction costs. Building affordable housing has become a puzzle that many politicians have falsely claimed they're going to be able to fix. So at least for the first chunk of 2021, I don't expect Biden's policies as it pertains to housing to be substantial enough to create any sudden increases in supply. Taking into account the eviction crisis, along with the coming vaccine and the comfort it will restore to sellers about strangers coming into their home so they can sell it, I'm labeling supply as a yellow factor with the potential of becoming red for a specific period of time in certain markets and submarkets. Now, one more factor that could influence the housing market despite low rates, strong demand, and short supply is tightened lending guidelines. Now, in reality, the likelihood of a Biden administration implementing policies that make it harder for buyers to qualify for financing is very slim, in my opinion. In fact, Biden has promised to further level the playing field and implement and enforce further fair housing rules, which would be difficult to do while at the same time cinching down on lending guidelines. And as lending stands currently, lending standards are already at some of the highest levels that they have been at for many years. So if anything, I would expect that changes in lending guidelines would be a positive stimulus to real estate prices, so I would give this a green label. Now, to summarize, any major change, whether positive or negative, in any of these four categories could independently alter the state of the housing market. However, the president's influence on these factors has its limits. The one thing I can say to keep in mind is that economically speaking, there is a very bright light at the end of the tunnel, and that is the vaccine. And independent of which administration would be holding office, I believe the American people are ready to come back to life with a vengeance, presuming the restrictive health measures imposed on businesses are returned to pre-COVID norms. For now, folks, I hope you found value in this, and if you did, I'd greatly appreciate you hitting that like button and sharing it with anyone else you think might find value in it. And of course, be sure to subscribe for more content like this, which I promise I will continue releasing. As always, folks, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.